Chapter 6. As soon as they got home, Abby rushed inside to put the bread and the pie in the oven. They'd have to wait a little bit to eat, but knowing how food was on the trail, Abby was certain there would be no complaints. While Anna and Abby chatted, Bastian took Stephen out to see the horses. "I plan on getting them all trained as soon as I can. When you come back in the spring, we may have to talk about horses." Stephen nodded. "I'd come to you first," he said. "I'm glad Abby is with you. I've known her and Anna since we were all small children, and it's good to see Abby with a man who isn't abusive." Bastian shook his head. "That man is evil. I would have traded for Abby even if I hadn't been interested in her as a wife. I'd have found her a job or something. The way that man treated her turns my stomach. And she helped him today. Abby has a strong sense of responsibility. She took care of her sick mother for a good portion of the trip. She was always the one to cook and do laundry for her family, and her father treated her as if she was lower than a servant. It made me angry, but Anna kept telling me not to interfere, so I didn't. I don't think it would have done any good. I didn't think she should help him today, but she explained she'd promised her mother she'd look out for him as best she could. And that was part of that promise." Stephen nodded, his eyes on one of the foals in the stable. "I want the one with the white stripe on his nose." Bastian nodded. "I call him Skunk. Do you want to ride him, or do you want him as part of a team? Could he pull a buggy on his own? I'm hoping I can have a single horse to pull my wife." Bastian nodded. "He'll be able to when he's grown." He pointed to another horse. "That stallion is his sire, and that mare is his mother. I think he'll be one of the strongest horses coming out of this stable." "Sounds good to me. Skunk is my horse of choice then. I'll make sure to have him ready in the spring." In the cabin, Abby and Anna chatted as if they could never talk to one another again. "Do you think Stephen really will select a parcel of land in this area?" Abby asked. "I so want you to move close." Anna nodded. "He knows he'll have a very weepy wife on his hands if he doesn't, and he hates it when I cry." "I hate it when you cry too." Anna carried the roast pork to the table while Abby whipped up gravy to go with their meal. "This feels like a feast after so long on the trail," Anna said. "And you seem to have settled right into your new life. I have the most amazing mother and sisters-in-law. They treat me as if I'd been around forever. We all share housework every day. Lately we've been canning different vegetables, but I've convinced Emma, one of my sisters-in-law, to pick apples with me tomorrow. I'm hoping we can find enough for me to make pies on for months. Apparently, my dear husband is obsessed with pie." Anna grinned. "You shouldn't have a hard time making him happy then. You've always made the best pies." "I hate making them," Abby confessed. "Who doesn't? Pie crusts are a pain, but I'm sure he appreciates your efforts. We'll have apple pie for lunch today. I added a bit more cinnamon than usual because I think it will taste better that way. But you'll tell me exactly what you think of the pie, right?" "Always have and always will," Anna responded. "So, how are things in the bedroom?" Abby looked at her in shock. "You can't ask me that. You're my best friend. If I can't ask you that, I can't ask anyone." "Things are fine. Last night was much better than the night before." "Every night will be better," Anna said. "I find myself thinking about our lovemaking throughout the day, and I can't wait for him to hold me at night. My first couple of nights with Stephen were really bad, but it got better with time. Now I even initiate lovemaking sometimes." Abby frowned. "I'm not sure I could ever do that." "Sure, you could. You've always been strong and outspoken." "I guess I have." Anna went to the window and looked out. "It looks like the men are headed back to the house." "Good." Abby pulled the pie out of the oven and set it on the work table to cool. Then she removed the bread, carrying 2 loaves to the table and leaving one beside the pie. She put the little butter she had left onto the table with everything else, and then she sat down at the foot of the table while they waited for the men to come inside. A moment later, Bastian and Stephen were inside, and they took seats at the table with Bastian sitting across from Abby, and Anna across from Stephen. "I really like the cabin," Anna said to Bastian. He shrugged. "Keeps us warm in winter." "I'm sure it does." Bastian lowered his head and said a quick prayer over their meal. Abby was happy to share their food with the others. It made her feel good to do something nice for her friend who had always watched out for her. While they ate, they talked about how nice it would be if Stephen and Anna moved to Clover Creek. "I hate that you still have so much travel to do before you can claim your land," Abby said. Stephen nodded. "I'm half tempted to leave Anna with you, but I'd starve to death, and there wouldn't be anywhere for her to live. I hate that she must endure the hardship with me." Bastian shrugged. "She'll be fine. All my brothers married women who had gone to Oregon and come back." Anna nodded emphatically. "I wouldn't want to be away from you for 6 months either. It's hard to do what you need to do when you love someone so much." Bastian made a face. "If I thought it would be best for Abby to continue on to Oregon City, I'd make sure she did that. I don't think my feelings could matter at all." "You couldn't send me away from you," Abby protested. "My job is to be here with you." "I guess it is," Bastian said. "But if it weren't safe, I wouldn't let you stay." "But you paid 6 oxen for me. You were worth so much more." Abby just laughed. "You keep telling me that." Anna smiled. "I'm glad someone other than me can see your worth. You're awfully special, Abby." After they'd eaten, Anna helped with the dishes, and the 2 women sat and chatted some more. They waited a little while to have the pie, but when Abby served it, she could see how excited Bastian was by it. "Are these the apples we picked last night?" he asked. Abby nodded. "Yes, I thought you'd appreciate a pie." "I always love pie," he said. "You should make another for tomorrow night. I'm hoping that Emma and I can get a bunch more of those apples, and I can put up pie filling for the winter. Then we can have pies until next spring when more fruits will be in season." Bastian sighed happily. "You are a 25 oxen wife. How could your father undervalue you so much?" Anna laughed. "I thought she was a 20 oxen wife earlier." "Oh, she was, but her value went up as soon as I tasted her pie. I wish I'd taken the time to whip some cream to go on top, but I'll make sure to do that next time." Bastian smiled contentedly. "You keep feeding me pie, and I'll keep you forever." "I thought you were already planning to keep me forever," Abby countered. "I guess so. But the pie makes it more realistic." When it was time to say goodbye to her friend, Abby could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. There had been very few days in her life without Anna beside her, and she was about to have 6 months of those days, at least. The 2 friends hugged tearfully, and the men shook hands. "Hurry back," Bastian said, looking at his wife's face. She looked utterly bereft. He'd never had a friend like Anna was to Abby, but he had very strong feelings for his brothers. Perhaps that was the same. When they were gone, Bastian pulled Abby down on his lap and simply held her while she cried. When she finally sat up straight and wiped her eyes, he said, "I have some crates in the cellar. We could go pick more apples. But that's what Emma and I are doing tomorrow. We'll have blackberries this week too. I wonder what apple blackberry pie would taste like." Bastian shrugged. "Delicious, I'm sure. Do you like jelly? I could make some apple jelly as well. Then you could have jelly for your toast." He shrugged. "I like it all right, but I really prefer pie." Pie it is. She'd make sure to get a jar or 2 of apple jelly for herself, but he obviously would rather she made pie filling out of every apple they picked. I'll also do our laundry tomorrow. I'll probably wash right after breakfast so I can still pick apples early. He nodded. All my dirty clothes are in the loft. The loft? She asked. That made no sense. Why would he climb up there to store his dirty clothes? He nodded. You can just go up there and throw them over the edge, then you can take them out and wash them. Do you need anything from me? Abby shook her head, though she still wondered why he'd put his dirty clothes in the loft where they were harder to reach. She got her answer the following morning as she and Emma were driving out to pick apples, planning to fill the crates Bastian had provided. Do you have any idea why Bastian would put his dirty clothes in the loft? Emma sighed. He throws them up there after they are too dirty to keep wearing. It keeps them out of the way, and he doesn't have to think about them until one of us tells him we're going to do laundry. Abby wanted to ask why he did it that way, but she was afraid of the answer. Bastian did some things in a way that seemed so illogical to her that she wondered how they'd ever get along. While picking the apples, Emma and Abby got to know one another better. How did it come about that you and your brother married brother and sister? Emma shrugged. Henri had her eye on Roy before we left Independence the same way I had my eye on Jared. By the time we got here, our crushes had been in our minds for a long time. It turned out Jared had been eyeing me, and Roy had been eyeing Henri. We were married soon after we settled here, and the weddings were only a week apart. Bastian said something about not trusting your cooking? Emma blushed. I had no idea what a terrible cook my mother was until after I'd gotten to know Henri and her family. I made supper one night for the Applebys, and it was a burnt mess. I thought it was delicious, and I expected praise. Instead, we ended up eating the meal Henri had left in the kitchen. Jared tried to tell the others it was a joke that I'd made such a terrible meal, but I don't think anyone believed it. Before he'd marry me, Jared made me agree to get cooking lessons from Henri, which is why the two of us are so close. I love your cooking, Abby said. That's because Henri spent months and months training me on how to be a better cook. I had never made a loaf of bread before I met Henri. My mother fried rice up in a pan with no water, and we all thought it was supposed to be crunchy. Emma shook her head. Ma's learned a lot from Henri as well, but lots of things she still cooks her own way. My family celebrates when Henri invites them over for meals. Abby smiled. And are you and Roy the only two in your family? No. I have two younger sisters. I'm surprised they weren't down at the campsite trying to find men they could be happy with. They both want to marry, but they're young. It must be nice to have sisters. Sometimes. Do you have any siblings? Emma asked. Abby shook her head. No, Ma had only me. Pa wanted a son, something fierce, but it never worked out that way. It was always just me. I think that's part of why he wanted to trade me. He would have preferred to take a son, but oxen were the only thing offered. Jared told me that every day Bastian says you are worth more oxen than the last. Is it strange for him to keep talking about that? Sure, Abby said, but Bastian seems just a bit odd, so I don't worry about it too much. Emma nodded. Bastian is a good man, but you're right. There's just something different about him. He's smart as a whip, and he's kind, but he doesn't seem to understand other people very well. You're right. He doesn't. By noon, the two women had filled 6 crates with apples. Abby had even climbed one of the trees and dropped apples to Emma, who stood with her apron held out in front of her. What are we doing with all these apples? Emma asked. There's no way we can eat them all before they rot. We're making apple pie filling. Bastian seems to be a bit obsessed with pie. Emma laughed. I hope you plan to share with all the families. Of course, I do. I want to do the same with blackberries. Perhaps by the end of the harvest, I'll have enough pie filling put up to make enough pies to keep Bastian happy through the whole winter. I hope you do. We all love pie. Are there any other berries or anything we can pick? Emma thought for a moment. Chokecherries. They're ripe now, and we can pick them. The trees usually grow in stream beds. I bet we could go pick some tomorrow. And we'll do blackberries on Wednesday. Then Thursday, Friday, and Saturday we'll make jams, jellies, and pie filling. I've never had chokecherries, but I'll figure out how to make them into pie filling. Plan to pick as many as possible tomorrow then. Emma smiled. It's nice to have someone who isn't expecting to harvest with. Abby grinned. I do hope to have a baby before too terribly long, but I'm glad I can be your harvest friend for now. Harvest sister, Emma said. Now, we're harvest sisters. So good to meet you, John. I hope you'll be settling around this area. John looked at Vicky as he said, I'll be settling here. My parents don't know where they want to go, but I know this is the place for me. Vicky blushed. I'll look forward to seeing you in the spring then. Abby smiled, moving away. She felt as if she'd done all she could for Vicky's love life. When she glanced back, she noticed Bastian was gone. She tried not to linger too long after he'd had to leave the church. She followed him outside and stood beside him, letting him know she was ready to leave whenever he was. The emigrants seem nice. One of them has his eye on Vicky. Bastian sighed. She's too young to marry. From what I understand, she's the same age Emma was when she married Jared. That's different, Bastian said. Why? Just is. Abby decided not to continue to argue with him. He was being stubborn. Are we still going for a picnic down by the lake today? She asked. I packed a lunch for us, and there's a blanket to eat on. He frowned for a moment and then nodded. I forgot we talked about that. Yes, we'll go, and I'll wait and start Skunk's training until I've studied just a bit more. Abby bit her lip. If you want to train Skunk, we can have a picnic another day. Though she was sure it would have to be in the spring if they put it off. The weather was already getting nippy. He shook his head. I'd forgotten, but I never don't follow through on a promise. All right. The picnic basket and blanket are in the back of the wagon. He walked to the wagon, helped her up, and then they started their long drive to Bear Lake. She hadn't had the opportunity to see it yet, and she was excited. As they drove, she questioned Bastian about what he'd learned about training foals. She could have chosen any topic, but she knew Bastian would have worked it around to talking about training foals anyway. When they reached the lake, Abby was thrilled. It's huge, she said. And I love how the mountains appear behind it. It just makes me want to jump right in. He chuckled. I don't think that's a great idea. Though I know there were a group of young men who thought it would be funny to take the plunge in January. Out of the 10 men who jumped in, only 1 died. That's not bad, considering how cold it was. Abby shook her head. That doesn't sound very smart to me. It wasn't, he told her. The others were sick. 2 caught pneumonia. I'm glad you were smart enough not to go with them. Bastian sighed. I try to be logical about everything. She spread the blanket and spread out the food she'd made. Do you want me to fix your plate? He shook his head. No, I'll take what I want. I did bring what was left of our pie from last night. He grinned at her. You know, you are the best wife a man like me could have asked for. I want to be worth those 6 oxen, she said. You're worth at least 35. Any woman who can make chokecherries taste like something I'd want to eat daily is worth more than 6. He sat on the blanket and chose the foods he wanted. She was a bit disappointed when he skipped over the green beans. What vegetables do you like? She asked. Potatoes, peas, carrots, and onion if it's cooked really well through. And that's all? She asked. It was best to know. If she could only fix those vegetables for the rest of her life, then that's what she'd do. Bastian nodded. The others all feel weird in my mouth. I don't know why, but I can't force myself to eat them. That's fine. If I want other vegetables, we'll eat them for lunch, she said. While they ate, she stared out at the water. It seemed quiet, with little movement, and there didn't seem to be even one boat out on it. Do you go out on boats during the summer? She asked. Bastian shrugged. There's really no time for frivolities during the summer. Or any other time of year. Being a rancher is hard work, and if I want to have the right to train horses, I need to do my share plus some. I see, Abby said, though she wished things were different. Her father had been the same way, never willing to do anything but work. What do you do when you have a minute or two for fun? He shrugged. I usually just read about horse training. All right. I should make sure I always have a book on hand then so we can read together. He nodded, not seeming terribly interested. Did you know if you blow on a horse's nose, they will learn your scent and be more likely to do what you need them to do when you train them? She smiled. Is that so? While they finished their meal, he talked to her about different methods of horse training, and she listened with a smile. He couldn't seem to focus on more than one thing at a time, but that was all right with her. It was nice to listen to his voice sometimes. And she'd never met a man who wasn't looking for a good conversationalist. She'd never have to worry about trying to find topics to talk to Sebastian about. He'd just change the topic to what he wanted to talk about anyway. On the drive home, she daydreamed as he reiterated everything he'd told her during their picnic. She couldn't help imagining a little boy who became as focused on one thing as his father. She could imagine her son saying, "Mama, I found a new kind of dung today. I know it's not cow or horse, but now I need to find out what kind of dung it is. Do you think you could help?" Chapter 8. Abby spent the following week harvesting the garden and putting up all they could with the other women in the family. All of them had worked together on the garden, so they all worked together to can the produce and shared it among them. At times, Vicky and Barbara, Emma's other sister, joined them. Both girls would pay very close attention to anything cooked, and they'd taken over many cooking days from their mother, now that they had learned what food should taste like. Saturday, they finished early so they could all go to their respective homes and make a dish for the church social. Many families can't afford to take a meat dish, so those of us that can, usually do. It makes things easier for all, Henri said as they separated. I was planning to make a chicken pie, Abby said. Will that work? Absolutely, Henri said. Though you may want to make 2 or 3. Everyone is supposed to take enough to feed their entire family, but when the food is scarce, it's easier if some of the families make more. Abby nodded. I'll make 3 then. I know it won't disappoint Bastian. Henri nodded, laughing. He got mad at Ma and me if we made cookies or cake. He always just wanted pie. I've noticed that about him. I've made 3 pies this week, and every time he finds me after eating the last piece and gives me this sad look as he tells me the pie is all gone. It's like he hasn't quite connected the fact that once he's eating a slice, there will be one less slice to look forward to. Henri grinned. That's my Bastian. I think he's mine now, Abby said. You can keep him then, Henri said with a laugh and a wave, as she carried the baby down the hill to her own cabin. Abby smiled as she hurried into the cabin to roll out 4 pie crusts. She had to make 3 for the social, but he'd also want a fruit pie. She reached for the raspberry pie filling and set it aside, ready to put it into the pie crust once it was ready. She dressed in her Sunday best after the pies were in the oven, and she carefully put her hair into a bun appropriate for a married lady. She'd always worn braids up until then, but it didn't seem at all dignified for a married woman to wear braids. The pies were cooling by the time Bastian got in from working with his father and brothers. He hurried and changed, wearing his Sunday best as well. Abby knew she needed to make a few dresses for herself, but there would be no time until after the harvest, and she'd ask for fabric then. When Bastian was ready, he looked at Abby. "You ready to go?" She nodded. "Just remember to tell me when it gets too loud, and we can leave." He nodded. "I may have to step outside to eat, but if I do, I'll come back to you when I'm done." He helped her carry the pies out to the wagon, and they stowed them in a couple of crates. No one wanted a squashed pie. When they got to the church, she saw that the yard was even busier than it usually was on Sundays, but then she realized there was another company camping. She'd been told this would be the last one for the year, which was good. It was already frosting in the mornings. She joined the other ladies in the church, who had set up a line for food. She stood behind her pot pies and was ready to serve them, but she'd left the sweet pie at home, knowing that Bastian wouldn't want to share it. As the men slowly came through the line, asking for the different things they wanted, she noted that most of the people from the camp must be there, but there were no women she didn't recognize in line. They must be serving the people from the wagon train, and she thought that was delightful. An entire community was willing to share their food with the immigrants who were walking through their town in search of freedom in the West. She knew her entire company would have been incredibly grateful for the opportunity to have one meal they didn't have to cook, hunt, or use their own food for, but it hadn't happened. No, this community was something special. Bastian ignored everyone's food on his way through the line, and only got pot pie from Abby. "I need more," he said when she placed 2 pieces on his plate. She laughed and gave him a bit more. "You have to share. We're feeding the camp." "I know." She leaned forward and whispered, "There's a sweet pie waiting at home." He grinned. "I won't ask for more then. I don't know what I did to deserve a wife like you, but I'm sure glad I did it." All 3 pies were gone quickly, and when Henri, who was standing beside her, noticed that her food was gone, she said, "Now you get to go and get in line." "Really? There's plenty more to serve." "Get in line." Abby grinned, removing her apron and walking around the long table to join the back of the line. She chose a little of everything, not wanting to hurt anyone's feelings. Besides, she'd never been picky about food. As long as there was something to eat, she was happy. She joined a group of women from the company coming through their community, chatting easily with them. "I'm glad you guys came when you did. This is the first church social we've had since I stopped here a couple of weeks ago." "How did you just stop here?" one of the women asked. "I met a man here and stayed. We've been married for a couple of weeks," she said, leaving out the fact that her husband had purchased her with oxen. It wasn't something she really wanted to talk about, though she and Bastian joked about it often. "Oh, how romantic," a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 said. "I hope I meet my future husband soon." Abby smiled. She didn't know the girl, and it was up to the girl's mother if she was allowed to marry so young. "It's a beautiful place and a wonderful group of people here." "It seems like it," one of the older women said. "You're the first community to allow us to eat with them, and it is much appreciated." Abby nodded. "I know this never happened when I was on the trail. We treated a couple of people from my company before they moved on, but I don't recall anyone doing something like this. Makes me proud to be part of something so kind." "I should think so." After their meal, several men from around town moved to one corner of the church and began playing music. Abby tapped her toes, enjoying it, but she joined the other women to wash up after the meal. When they were finished cleaning, Abby went outside to find Bastian. He was leaning up against their wagon, talking to a stranger. "Do you think we could dance once?" Bastian nodded. "As long as I come out between dances, and you don't mind coming to get me, I should be able to keep going tonight." Abby's face lit up. This was her first dance to attend, where she had a man who was hers. It was nice to be able to go out and dance. The song was a fast one, which didn't seem to bother Bastian one bit. He virtually threw her around the dance floor, spinning her and bobbing back and forth. When the song was over, he smiled. "Come get me when you're ready. I think I'll choose a slower song next time." Bastian laughed. "You're fun to dance with." Abby found an empty chair and collapsed into it, and Henri found her quickly. "I can't believe you let him throw you around like that. I've never seen a girl last through a whole song dancing with Bastian." Abby laughed. "It was fun." Henri shook her head. "I've always heard there's someone for everyone, but it wasn't until I saw you dance with Bastian that I really believed it. I'm so glad you married my brother." "I am too," Abby said, grinning. Dancing with Bastian was fun, but she would try a much slower song next time. They stayed until the men packed up their instruments to go home. Abby wandered outside to find Bastian again talking to someone. "The music is over." Bastian nodded. "I guess my wife wants to go home, and I want to eat the pie she made me." The other man laughed. "Have a nice night." "You too." Bastian helped Abby into the wagon and drove home. "I spent the whole night listening to other men complain about their wives. I'm so glad I married a woman who gives me nothing to complain about." Abby laughed. "I'm sure you'll have complaints about me as time goes on." Bastian shrugged. "I don't think so. You're the perfect wife for me." At home, she carried the empty pie plates inside while she put 2 plates on the table and cut the pie that was waiting for them. She was glad she'd made all 3 pot pies, because she hadn't realized they were feeding the company camped there. It made it a great deal easier for them to feed everyone when people brought triple what they would feed their own families. Bastian walked in and washed his hands before finding his spot at the table. 2 pieces, please." Abby laughed. "You earned them by dancing with me." He grinned. "I'll happily do just about anything for pie. I've noticed that about you." Asterisk. The men were leaving on Monday to drive the cattle to market. This was their first year to do so, as they'd used the previous year to build up their herds. Even if the winter was difficult, Abby knew they had enough food stored for the winter, especially since they were keeping several steers for the beef. The women had told her that as soon as they got back from the cattle drive, the men would spend all their time hunting, so they would have wild game to add to their food supplies. Abby had never lived in such an out-of-the-way place, so she was surprised at how little they could count on receiving from the store. The men would be gone for 3 weeks and would return home tired and needing home-cooked meals from what Henri had said. But while they were gone, it would make chores a little easier on the women. She would move enough clothes into Melody's house on Monday afternoon that she shouldn't have to go home much when they were gone. They all woke early on Monday, and the women served a hot breakfast in the main house for the men before they left. Melody seemed concerned, but she tried to cover it up. "I think you should let the younger men go, and you stay home with me," she said to Pa. He chuckled. "I was only 2 years younger than I am now when I traveled the Oregon Trail. Surely, I'm still young enough to go to Idaho Falls on a cattle drive." Melody frowned, but reluctantly nodded. "Make sure you build a good fire every night." They were taking a trail cook and all but 4 of the cowboys, leaving a skeleton crew for Bastian and the women. "Hurry, but not too fast," Bastian said. "Go at a fast, safe pace. There are mountain passes that you'll need to take slowly." The entire meal was spent with advice given and mostly ignored by the men leading the cattle drive. "Maybe next year, you'll feel safe just sending the men," Emma said. Jared shook his head at his wife. "No, one of us will always need to go. We don't want our men absconding with the cattle." "Are you worried they will?" Emma asked, surprised. He laughed. "No, not really. Especially not with so many of us going along with them. The men are used to taking orders from us." Bastian grinned. I hope to have that full eating out of my hand by the time you get back. I'm sure that won't be hard for you, Sam said. You've always had a way with animals. Bastian nodded. He was excited about the cattle drive because it meant they would finally see a return on their investment, but he really didn't want to go. Especially not with a brand new wife he enjoyed being with. As the men left, the women stood on the front porch of the big house and waved to them. Bastian was already off and working with Skunk and giving the men staying home their instructions for the day. There wasn't a dry eye on any of the women. Even Abby shed a tear watching them go, though hers was mostly a sympathy tear for her friends and new sisters. When they went back into the quiet house, Melody said, "I think we need to harvest everything still in the garden and can it today. Then we won't be thinking about what we're missing." Abby nodded emphatically. "Emma and I can harvest while the rest of you start the canning process." Henri smiled. "I'd like that a lot." Emma and Abby carried their baskets outside and carefully picked everything from the garden. They didn't want to leave a single thing that could be eaten. It would seem wasteful. It took them most of the first day, with just a short break for lunch. When they finally carried the last of the produce inside, Melody told them they were taking the rest of the day off. "You can help us with the canning tomorrow, but you did the bulk of the work by getting all the food out of the garden." "Thank you." The other women echoed Melody's thanks. "We'll all have supper together here every night," Melody said. "Many hands make the work so much easier." Abby smiled, nodding. She was sore from all the harvesting, but glad it was done. Now it was just a matter of canning what they could and storing the rest. It had been a hard day of work, but it was worth it. Chapter 9. After a couple of days, Abby realized that she really didn't like staying in Melody's house. She loved her mother-in-law and the baby, but she didn't like how strange she felt being in bed with her husband in someone else's home. She got up early each morning, fixing breakfast for the three of them, but Melody cooked the rest of the meals. And she rarely made pies, which made Bastian sad. By the end of the 3 weeks, they had all the crops harvested and canned, and she was happy with their accomplishment, but she was ready to go home and live with just her husband again. When the men got home, they were dead tired, but his pa had perked up when Bastian asked how it had gone. "We got $10 per head more than expected. It was a very profitable trip." "That's great, Pa." His father nodded. "I can see what you're thinking. If we got paid that much more than we thought, we can move you to full-time horse training, and you're right, we can. As soon as I can get 2 more cowboys working for us, you'll be able to train." Bastian looked happier than Abby had ever seen him. "That's great." Bastian hugged her close, the first time he'd voluntarily shown affection for her in public. Oh, he helped her down from the wagon or helped her up, but other than that, he didn't touch her publicly. It was odd to her, but she didn't complain. A woman worth 46 oxen, which he'd declared she was just the night before, didn't complain. As they walked home, she thought about the pie she'd made earlier that day and smiled. They'd been expecting the men to arrive any day, so she'd gone home and made a pie that afternoon, thinking if his brothers and father didn't arrive home, they could take a walk over to the cabin, and she could make sure he got his pie. She smiled as they walked home after spending a little time with his father and brothers. "I have a surprise for you at home." "Pie?" he asked. "I can't believe I've gone this long without eating one of your pies. I feel positively lost without it." She laughed. "Yes, it's pie. I did a mix of blackberry and raspberry for this one." He grinned. "I can't wait." "You don't have to. I baked it earlier today, and it's been cooling all afternoon." They'd finished supper right before the men had driven in, so she didn't need to cook immediately. They just needed to finish their pie and maybe spend some time in bed together. They hadn't made love during the 3 weeks they'd spent at Melody's house, and she was surprised at how very much she missed it. She got them each a piece of pie, leaving the rest of it on the table, knowing he'd want more than 1 or 2 pieces. I'm sorry, I didn't feel like I could cook pie every day while we were living with Melody, but I wasn't about to suggest we come back here. Melody needed someone there for support. It's all right. Just make lots of pies now to make up for it. His entire focus was on his pie, and he had 4 pieces before he stopped. 3 pieces left for tomorrow. You can have 1 and I'll have 2, unless you don't like this pie, and then I'll eat all 3. She laughed. You can have all the pie. I don't mind. He grinned, his teeth interesting colors from the pie. Have I mentioned what a wonderful wife you are yet today? She shook her head. No, but I'm starting to believe you when you do say it. Have I ever mentioned that I wanted to flog your pa? No, I don't believe you have. When I saw him raise his boot to kick you, I wanted to hurt him. But he stopped in time that I had no excuse for beating him. Thank you for wanting to save me from him. I got the best wife I could have asked for as part of the bargain. She laughed. You only think that because I make so many pies for you. No, you're wonderful in other ways as well. He stretched. Speaking of which, I think we should go to bed early tonight. Oh, she asked, grinning. Yes. It felt lonely sleeping with you at Melody's. You never invited me to play on your side of the bed. She laughed. I'll be ready to play just as soon as I finish up these dishes, she said. How did it go with Skunk today? I think he's turning into a wonderful horse. He lets me put a saddle on him, and he doesn't try to fight me when I lead him by rope. He's going to be a fine horse for Stephen and Anna. I hope they do come back in the spring, she said. She worried often that her friend and her husband would find a place they liked better between there and Oregon City, and then she'd be left alone without her best friend. She'd made good friends there in Clover Creek, but that didn't mean she didn't miss Anna, something fierce. Bastian looked at her. You miss her, but not your pa. Abby nodded, even though she felt a bit guilty admitting her feelings. I do. Do you miss your ma? Yes. I miss her a lot. The 2 of us were very close. If she was around, Pa wouldn't even kick me. Bastian shook his head. Did he kick you often? Abby shrugged, not sure what often meant when it came to kicking fathers. Dishes are finished, she said, glad to be able to change the topic. She didn't want to think about how her father had treated her. She wanted to think about her bright future with Bastian. He stood and walked to her, scooping her into his arms and making her laugh. Bed. I couldn't agree more. His lovemaking that night was as sweet as honey. He'd learned exactly what she liked and didn't like, and he made sure she was always satisfied before he let himself go. They'd both learned a lot about each other in the month of their marriage. Afterward, he laid on his side and held her close. 50 oxen. That's what I should have paid for you. She chuckled and snuggled close to him. However many you want, she said softly. To her surprise, he forgot about his rule about people touching him while he slept that night. He held her close and never once complained. She felt bereft for a moment when he turned from her in the middle of the night to sleep on his side facing the wall. It had been nice touching for so long. She quickly drifted back to sleep, dreaming about her wonderful life. It seemed that nothing would stand in the way of her happiness. It was time things finally went her way. Now that she knew it was his favorite, she woke early and fixed bacon, eggs, and toast for breakfast. When he came in from the milking, he carried a bucket of milk that he set on the work table. Skunk got so excited when he saw me that he rushed over and nudged me with his nose. I'm going to miss him. It won't be profitable if you only train the horses you want to keep, she said with a smile. You should hang a sign in town saying you're training horses. I bet different men would bring you their horse so you could help it to fulfill its destiny. That's not a bad idea. I'll ask Pa if it would be all right if I made a sign like that and put it up in the store. I know Jensen won't mind. That's a really good idea, she said. He laughed. It was yours. That must be why it was so good, she said, winking at him. He sat down and looked at his eggs. He was very particular about the yolk being totally cooked. Looks perfect, he said. She took her seat beside him and joined her hands with his for their prayer. I'd like to go into town with you when you go, she said. If you don't mind. I don't, he said. Are you looking for something in particular? She nodded. I feel like all my dresses are falling apart. Even my Sunday best needs to become a work dress. I'd love to get some fabric to make a new dress or two. Get enough for 3, he said. You work hard, and you deserve to have pretty dresses. Emma might help you make them. Is she a good seamstress? Abby had always been good at making her own clothes, but she'd never enjoyed it. Perhaps she could trade chores with Emma. Oh, yes. She's wonderful at it. I'll talk to her then. She'd be willing to scrub Emma's house from top to bottom or even cook for her and Jared for a week or 2. Anything so she didn't have to waste her time sewing. All right, he said. As soon as they'd finished eating, he put on his hat and pulled a coat on. I'm going to run and talk to Pa. I'm sure he'll think it's a good idea. How many horses would you like to do at one time? She asked. He shrugged. Ideally 4 or 5. Then I could do a morning and afternoon session with each every day. I'll be back. He hurried out the door, and she stood staring at it momentarily before laughing. The man was always so focused on what he wanted or needed to do he didn't remember the social niceties. He probably didn't think he needed to remember them with his wife. He came back as she was finishing up the dishes. He said that's fine as long as we don't take too long. There's lots to be done today, and he wants me to be able to spend my last 2 hours training Skunk. She wiped her hands on her apron, taking it off, and pulling a shawl off a peg by the door. She threw it over her shoulders and said, I'm ready. He leaned down and kissed the tip of her nose. She couldn't help but smile. It was a new thing for him to show her affection when he wasn't wanting to go to bed with her. She liked it more than she could express. They hurried out to the wagon he'd hitched up after talking to his father. Let's go. He drove a little faster than she would have liked down the steep hill into town. It was a straight shot down to the mercantile, and he stopped in front. I forgot to make a sign, he said, hitting the back of his head with the heel of his hand. I'm sure Mr. Jensen will have something you can use. Inside, Mrs. Jensen was at the counter. Abby knew her from church, but as this was only her second time in the store, she'd not seen her there before. She walked straight to the sweet woman. Bastian and I came to town so he could put up a sign, and then he forgot to make it. We're in a hurry and don't want to return home. Do you have a piece of paper and pen he can use? Penelope Jensen nodded, holding a baby on one hip as she reached for paper. Do the shopping you want to do. I'll help Bastian. Thank you. Abby really liked Penelope but had little time to talk to her. Thankfully, they were going to start having a quilting circle every Wednesday afternoon now that gardens were in. She made a mental note to talk to Penelope when she got the chance. Looking through the yard goods, Abby found 3 fabrics that she really liked. She also chose some white fabric so she could make another nightgown and an apron. Once Bastian was working on his note, she called Penelope over to cut the fabric. Thank you for all your help today, Abby said. Mr. Appleby wants Bastian back quickly so he can work. They just got in from the cattle drive last night. Oh. Penelope said. How did the cattle drive go? They made a good amount more per head than they expected to, Abby said with a smile. We have some very happy men around the ranch. Penelope smiled. I'm glad to hear it. They are so easy to work with. I need to buy another side of beef soon, she said. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to accommodate you. They kept some of the steer back for the next year's butchering. They're smart men. Soon, Bastian and Abby were on their way back up the hill. How'd the sign turn out? She asked. She hadn't taken the time to look at it when he was done. Good, I hope. I put it on the board at the back of the store. That's where everyone goes if they're looking to buy or sell something. He glanced over at her, taking his eyes off the road for just a moment. What do you have planned for the day? He asked. I'm going to talk to Emma and beg her to trade chores with me. We'll see how that goes. We're all meeting up at Emma's this morning. Are you going to ask her to make the dress? I am. I'll do whatever she needs in exchange. Sounds fair to me, Bastian said, stopping the wagon in front of their cabin and jumping down to unhitch the wagon. Abby took the fabric from the back of the wagon and carried it with her to Emma's house. To Abby's surprise, she was the first one there. I have a huge favor to ask. Emma looked up from where she was kneading dough to get it ready to rise. What's that? Bastian said you're an excellent seamstress. I was hoping if I did some of your chores for a while, you would make 3 dresses for me. Emma nodded. You don't even have to do my chores. Abby frowned. I can't accept it if you don't let me work it off. All right. Emma looked around as if she was trying to find something that needed doing. Why don't I start with your laundry? I'll strip the bed and wash it all, and I'll bake your bread as well. Emma nodded. All right. Abby got started stripping the bed and pulled down the curtains as well. I'll just make sure to wash these as well. How long has it been since your floor was scrubbed? Emma laughed. Since before the men left, but no one's been here. I'll do that when I'm done hanging the clothes and kneading the bread. All right. Emma spread the fabric out on the dining table. She'd been taught that most dresses needed to be made the same size. That way, it would fit whether a woman was pregnant or not and would fit through feast and famine. She took out scissors and started cutting immediately. Abby sang as she hung the clothes on the line. She was so much happier cleaning than she was sewing. Chapter 10. By November, a thick blanket of snow was on the ground, turning the beautiful green landscape into a winter wonderland. Emma had completed all 3 of Abby's dresses, but Abby had waited to wear them. Bastian had promised her a sleigh ride on Sunday, and she was looking forward to it. They were settling into something of a cold weather routine. She and the other ladies still got together every day, but there were no longer foods to can or gardens to harvest, so they moved from house to house, and all the women worked on projects together. Mostly they quilted or sewed, but because Abby hated to sew more than she hated anything else in the world, she spent her time knitting instead. She knitted scarves, hats, and mittens for all the men in the family, and some booties for the baby Emma was expecting. Abby kept praying for a baby, but hadn't been rewarded yet. Soon, she hoped. Of course, her mother had wanted many children, but she'd only had Abby. Perhaps that would be how things would go with her as she tried to get pregnant. The joy and laughter she felt day after day was immeasurable. Sometimes the other women would laugh about something Bastian had said or done, but Abby kept quiet. To her, Bastian seemed to live in another world, away from the rest of them. He was generally content with life, but there were times when it all became too much for him, and he had to step away to be alone. There were now church socials on the first Saturday night of each month, and Abby looked forward to them, though she knew Bastian may not be able to remain inside for the entire event. On the Saturdays when they didn't go to a church social, one of the women would host the entire family for a game of cards. They'd split up into teams and play hand after hand. The game they all loved was euchre, and they all enjoyed it. Sometimes there was a baby at the table with them, and sometimes they all slept. It didn't seem to matter which way it went for their entertainment level. On the second Saturday of November, Henri announced she was expecting again. Her face was positively glowing as she talked about it, and Roy seemed to be a proud papa. While she was happy for Henri, Abby was also sad. She wanted a baby of her own. Henri already had one. Why wasn't it her turn? Just don't let your stepmother get pregnant again. Pa had called out. I have 5 children, and that should be enough for anyone. Henri laughed. I think you're more in control of that than I am, Pa. Abby felt like everyone was staring at her for not being pregnant, but when she looked up from her cards, everyone was looking at Henri. Maybe no one thought she'd ever get pregnant, and maybe they were right. She wanted to break down and cry, but there was no reason. No, she would bide her time, and surely God would bless her and Bastian with their own child. She was quieter than usual for the rest of the night, wondering why some people were so blessed when others were left wanting. After they finished playing for the night, she and Bastian walked home to the pie she had waiting for him. He didn't know about it, but she knew he'd be pleased. The man couldn't turn down a pie if his life depended on it. Once home, she cut the pie, carried it to the table, and set it down. Then she fetched 2 plates and forks, and 2 glasses of milk. While they ate, Bastian watched her closely. Finally, he said, I'm not good at reading faces or knowing what people are thinking, but you seem awfully sad tonight. Is something wrong? She started to shake her head, but then she thought it was better to open up to him. I'm just sad that it was Henri announcing she was expecting tonight and not us. He put his hand on top of hers. It'll happen. We've only been married for 6 weeks and half of those we spent at Pa's place and nothing happened between us. I'm sure it'll happen soon. Abby felt a tear drip down her cheek, and she swiped it away angrily. She was much too old to sit and cry over apple pie. I'm sorry. I was really hoping it would happen. He nodded. I also want a baby, but I don't think stressing over it will make it happen. Do you want to see the doctor and make sure nothing is wrong? She shook her head immediately. No, there's no reason for that. It hasn't been long enough to worry about, but I'm borrowing trouble. Yes, you are, he said, but if you want to see the doctor, I'll take you. She shook her head. No, we don't need to do that. I'm just glad you're not angry that it hasn't happened yet. Angry? Seriously? I get to play with my playground longer if you're not expecting yet. His face was so serious as he said the words that Abby couldn't hold back a laugh. You make me really happy, Bastian. I love you. Bastian looked at her for a moment and finally said, thank you. Abby wanted to ask how he felt about her, but she knew Bastian too well to do that. If he needed more time before he knew that he loved her, then she'd give it to him. She wanted him to be sure when he eventually told her he loved her anyway. After church the following morning, they had their Sunday dinner, and then Bastian hitched up the sleigh. Where are we taking it? She asked. He shrugged. I thought I'd just go wherever the horses took me. I love long drives on snowy days. All right, she bundled up as well as she could and carried a thick quilt out to the sleigh to rest across their laps. The sleigh was tightly built, and they sat completely pressed up against one another on the seat. He drove down the hill and then they headed out toward the lake. She didn't ask again where they were going because he obviously had something in mind. After an hour or two, she realized they'd bypassed the lake, and they were heading up a mountain across the lake from where they lived. Finally, they made it to the top, and they could look out over the lake and see the hill they lived on, if not, make out their home. Bastian got out of the sleigh and held his hand down for Abby's. When she got out, he wrapped his arms around her from behind. I think this is the most beautiful place in the whole area, he said softly. She smiled and nodded. I've never seen anything like it. When I asked you to go for a sleigh ride with me, I had no idea where I intended to go. I was thinking more about whipping around the valley together, and maybe visiting a couple of friends. But last night, when you told me you loved me, I knew this is where we needed to come. It felt so good to hear you say the words, that I realized you would feel good if you heard them as well." Abby's heart beat faster at the idea that he would tell her how much he cared. It felt good to know he was even thinking about it. "Yes. So, I brought you here, because there's not a more beautiful place in all the world to tell my wife that I love her with every fiber of my being. I've known for a long time I felt that way, but I didn't think it mattered if I said them. Last night, you taught me differently, so I'm standing here, on this mountain, looking over the valley, to tell you how much I love you. I didn't know loving someone as much as I love you was possible. And now that we're here, I feel like I can't stop." She turned in his arms and looked at him. His brown eyes were staring deeply into her own. He was odd, but that was all right. She loved everything about him, and she always would. "I love you too, Bastian, and I never want you to stop. You make me laugh and smile, and you make me a better person. You make me pies," he said. Abby felt the laugh rumbling up from deep within her. "I will always make you pies. I know that you need them to stay happy, and no woman could ever be satisfied with an unhappy man. And there'll be new kinds of pie in the spring," he said. "I don't know if I could ever tell you how much I love the pies you make. You don't even have to try. I can see it on your face every time you take a bite. How did I get so lucky to get you in trade for just 6 oxen? You are a 100 oxen woman if there ever was one." As they drove back, she was filled with happiness. Bastian loved her back, and for more than just her pies. He loved her for her. It was a very nice thing to hear. Before bed that night, she put on her new nightgown that Emma had made for her, not realizing just how flimsy the thing was. It was sleeveless, and there was lace all over the bodice, which was beautiful, but also revealing. She walked to the table to stand beside Bastian, who was reading another book on horse training. He ordered them from the mercantile whenever he heard there was a new one out. "Are you ready for bed?" she asked. He glanced up from his book, and instead of saying, "Just let me finish this chapter," as he usually did, he put a piece of paper to mark his page, his gaze on the lace covering her bosom. He swooped her up into his arms and carried her into the bedroom, dropping her on the bed. "I remember you saying something about wanting a baby," he said. "Is that still the case?" She lay on the bed watching him divest himself of clothing faster than ever. He hadn't even bothered to turn down the lamp in the main room. When he was completely naked, she whispered, "You should turn down the lamp." He looked over his shoulder and grunted, walking back into the main room, shutting off the light, and returning to their bedroom, shutting the door behind him. "Now, let's see about making that baby." Epilogue. It took longer for them to make a baby than either Abby or Bastian anticipated. In late May, Abby realized she'd missed her cycle for the past 2 months. She sat at the kitchen table after cooking a breakfast that she hadn't been able to keep down and counted on her fingers. When she realized she was expecting, it was all she could do not to jump up and down. Of course, doing so would have led to her getting sick again, so she decided not to make any sudden movements. Instead, she sat there for a few minutes, just thinking of names she liked. She knew it was early, but the baby needed a name. Instead of walking to Melody's house where they were all meeting that morning to plant their new garden, she walked to the stable. There, she saw Bastian working with a new foal. She tapped Bastian on the shoulder. He spun to face her after jumping. "Don't do that." She grinned. "Sorry." "Are you feeling better?" he asked. "Not really, but that's all right." "No, it's not all right. I'll hitch up the wagon and take you to see the doctor." "There's no need," she said. "I know what's wrong with me. Or rather that there's nothing wrong with me." "If you're sick to your stomach, then something is wrong," he insisted. "Not if I'm expecting." He stood looking at her momentarily before gathering her in his arms. His first instinct was to spin her in a circle, but he didn't particularly want the contents of her stomach coming back up again. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I'm sure. I'll see Mrs. Mitchell later this week, but I'm sure." His smile seemed to stretch from ear to ear. "We're having a baby," he shouted. "Well, now I guess we don't have to do a big announcement, because the whole ranch knows already." He chuckled. "Maybe I shouldn't yell about it, but we've been trying for so long. I guess we finally got it right." He pressed his lips to her ear and whispered something she was glad no one else heard. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather try with," she said, her face lit with laughter. "I love you, Abby Appleby. I don't ever want you to forget it." "Oh, I won't. But my name sounds silly, so don't say the two together anymore, all right?" He laughed. "It does sound funny. I guess I should have told you my last name before I married you." She shrugged. "It wouldn't have mattered. You were willing to pay 6 oxen for me, so there's no way my father would have let me back out of the wedding." "Silly man. You were worth at least 1,000. Abby smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Only you would say so."